Thank you. It's so great to be here. You know, one of the things that my father used to do with my family when we were growing up is my dad grew up in a small town, and we spent the summers in central Minnesota on my grandpa's farm and both of my uncles' farm nearby. And my dad grew up in a Catholic Bohemian family, so about every third person we ran into was one of his first cousins. There were many, many of them. But one of the things we did is we went on road trips here and there as I was growing up is we always stopped in small-town libraries. My dad was a really avid reader, and I remain an avid reader, and so we would always go in and case the joint when we were rolling through small towns. And so I have a very special place in my heart as a person who loves to read, but also as someone who was taught to have an appreciation for the role that libraries play in a community. And so it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here, especially because the grass is greener 2 hours south from where I live. So the skies might be gray, but at least you got a little color on the landscape. And I can't say that about the Twin Cities right now. It's both gray and gray, up and down. So what I'm going to do for about the next 20 minutes is set some context for you. I think Amy introduced me as someone who's an expert in local foods. I just like to think of myself as a person who really likes to eat. And I really like to eat really, really good food. And in my experience, the best food is food that's local. It tastes the best. It's the most fun to prepare. I like to be creative in the kitchen. And so that's kind of how I came into the local foods piece, both through my family's agricultural history and also my passion for cooking, which is mostly because I have a passion for eating. So what I'm going to do is set a little bit of context to give you a sense of what's happening nationally with the local foods movement and how it relates to what you're doing in your kitchens and your backyards and in your home communities. And I'm also learning how to use this thing here. So one of the things I wanted to start out with is to ask you some questions. How many of you here have a garden that you plant and grow food with? Okay, so a fair number of you. And how many of you hunt or fish for food? How many of you are hunters or fishers? In the refrigerator. In the refrigerator, I see. That's the foraging. I guess it should say wild mushrooms or midnight snacks. How many of you are canning or preserving food in some way, smoking it, canning it? So a fair number of you. And how about wild food gathering, mushroom hunting, or how about small animals, chickens in your yard, chicken coops, lambs, or rabbits, or that kind of thing? So a few of you, not too many. And how about the big ones, hogs, cows, and the like? Not so much, huh? We got one or two. You know, my dad went to high school in Staples, Minnesota, and he moved from the farm where my grandparents lived into town to live with his aunt so he could go to high school. And they had a very small backyard in the middle of town, but they had a cow in their backyard. And his trade for room and board was to go milk the cow every morning. So don't let your small backyard stop you from raising your own dairy. How many of you, now we've seen how many of you are actually producing in some way or sourcing your own food. You're feeding yourselves from the ground on up. How many of you are regular shoppers at farmers markets? Okay, so when you look around the room, pretty much everybody's raising their hands. And how many of you are buying food from a neighbor or acquaintance that may be growing or hunting or producing the food? So a fair number of you. So I guess you all qualify in one way or another as local foods meisters, right? I mean, you all have it in your diet in one way or another. Many of us who are interested in the local foods movement do. Page down. Page down. I bet I was pressing page up. Yeah, I told her the technical difficulties would be me, would start and finish with me. So as you consider all these ways that you source your food locally, of your entire diet, what percentage would you say the food that you have is either grown or obtained locally? Any guesstimates from you guys about what that might look like?
This time of year it would be much different than in August.
So it's seasonal. So in August you may be chowing down locally. Now, a little beef jerky or the lamb sausage. Very little. So how many of you would guess that 50% of the food that you consume in that you have control over, that you cook and prepare is locally produced on average? Wow. How many is it 80%? How many of you? What about 20%? Okay, a fair number of you. How about less than 10%? So a couple of you. Okay, a few of you. So that should give you a general idea what's going on in your community, but not surprisingly, that is something that's reflected nationally, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If you look at the local foods movement nationally, and it's sort of funny to think of a national-local movement, isn't it? But there you go. Oftentimes people point the finger at Alice Waters in California and say she's the one that started talking to farmers to get food into her restaurant in Berkeley, California that was local and fresh. She started it, and she did that because she lived in France and she watched how the French did it, and so she wanted that back in her restaurant in Berkeley, California. Well, for those of us who grew up with gardens and canning, we know that Alice Waters didn't start that. It actually has been around a while. But we've also seen other trends taking place. The slow food movement, which started in Italy, but a lot of chefs and other folks have gotten into, where it's reclaiming mealtime and the joy of slow food preparation in a contrast to fast food processed. The national media attention that the local foods movement has gotten, whether it's the Super Size Me documentaries that scare everybody about processed foods, or it's the idea, this new agrarianism that we're seeing, this new romance with agriculture and old school foods and old school practices around eating and growing food. We've also seen this movement nationally with more farms selling directly to schools and people saying, man, we got to give these kids something else to eat, and it should be fresh, and fresh means local. We've also seen this groundswell of artisan food being produced, all different kinds of cheeses, all different kinds of sausages. You'll have an opportunity to taste some of that in a few minutes. We've seen an absolute massive explosion in farmers markets, from a couple pickup trucks on Main Street to, big, huge warehouses full of vendors. There's an explosion of farmers markets all over the country. A renaissance in urban community gardening, which has been around for a while, but increasing numbers of folks are getting interested. And that also includes backyard chicken coops. You're seeing more and more folks keeping chickens in their backyard in cities. We're also hanging on to that tradition of rural food production, whether it's folks like some of you here who are gardening, or people that are actually small and medium-sized farms producing food for others' consumption. And we're seeing a lot of new immigrant communities doing a lot of their own food production and contributing to this local foods movement. The Twin Cities is a great example. A lot of the producers that you see at the Minneapolis and St. Paul farmers markets are Southeast Asian growers, so continuing their agricultural tradition even in the new environment that they're living in. And finally, people's concerns about how much soda pop and McDonald's we're all eating, that the diabetes and obesity issues that folks are suffering from somehow should and can be mitigated, people are thinking, by local food consumption. So what's happening here with local foods? Well, when Super Size Me made that movie and started talking about this fast food nation that we live in, inherent in that is this critique about, what happens when we rely on all of our food as being sourced from international or national, when we ship all of our produce from California, and we don't have much going on over here. And what we're finding with the local foods movement is we spent a lot of time in Sector B. So there's this explosion of farmers markets. There's a lot of you, like I am, buying products directly from farmers and food purveyors. Community-supported agriculture is another example. And so what we're seeing is a lot of activity here in the local foods movement in Sector B. And then there is some increase in folks, like I said, beginning to garden, this sort of retro. I'm watching all these young women in their 20s who haven't ever canned before, teaching themselves and forming canning clubs. So there's this personal food production piece that's happening. And then what we see in Sector C is right now the industrial agricultural system spends a lot of time and controls a lot of this middle ground where foods are brought together, aggregated, and then redistributed to grocery stores, restaurants, and food service outlets at hospitals or restaurants or the like. And so what we're seeing here is the bulk of Sector C, which could go either way, industrial or local, tends to be, particularly in Minnesota, primarily controlled by the industrial food system. But we're starting to see some movement beginning to happen here, at least a rising of interest. So currently, what does the local foods movement feel like nationally? Well, we're seeing it's highly diversified. There's all sorts of stuff going on, and we're not quite sure how it's going to shake out yet. There's cheese being made. There's pasture-fed dairy. There's sausages and value-added products like jams and honeys and that kind of thing. There's a lot of activity going on. It's very idiosyncratic, so you can't necessarily get Milk, that's pasture-fed all over the state of Minnesota. You can in certain communities, and you'd have to drive 200 miles to get it in other communities in Minnesota. It's very fragmented. So as I said in the previous slide,